Ilana Snyder es profesora de la Universidad de Monash, Australia, y sus investigaciones se han enfocado en los cambios que han sufrido las prácticas de alfabetización asociados al uso de tecnologías digitales y sus implicaciones en la alfabetización en la escuela. Tiene un particular interés por temas como el hipertexto, la relación tecnología e inclusión social y las teorías literarias contemporáneas. Entre sus publicaciones podemos destacar los libros Doing Literacy Online, Teaching, Learning and Playing in an Electronic World, Silicon Literacy, Communication, Innovation and Education in the Electronic Age, y otros de sus textos como Teachers and Techno-Literacy, Managing Literacy, Technology and Learning in School. Al final de la intervención de la profesora, quien también contará con 1 hora para la misma, los asistentes tendrán una ronda de preguntas, tiempo que estará controlado por el sistema de paletas. Paleta amarilla cuando falten 15 minutos y paleta roja cuando falten 5 minutos. Esto para la intervención de la profesora, y como les hemos dicho durante toda la mañana, terminada la conferencia, tienen un espacio para las preguntas. Invitamos entonces a la profesora. Adelante.
Okay, hola. Thank you very, very much for inviting me to come to this symposium on literacy, media and ICTs in very, very beautiful Medellin. I'm overwhelmed by how lovely the city is, located so beautifully in the valley between the mountains. This is my first time in Colombia, and I hope not my last. Now, my focus today is the connections between critical literacy, cultural form, and ICT. The central question, the big question that I want to cover today is what counts as critical literacy education in a world increasingly mediated and shaped by the use of information and communication technologies, in particular the internet and the web. Now, I want you to keep that question in mind as I take you on a very rapid tour of the internet and the web to look at some of the cultural forms now evident. They're splendidly hybrid, often exploiting information and communication technologies in creative and unexpected ways, but also, and very importantly, intimately connected to many of the cultural forms that we associate with the late age of print. Now, after we've surveyed the digital landscape, while taking account of the key words I've chosen to focus on today, they are literacy, cultural form, information and communication technologies, ICT, and critical literacy. And I'm going to talk a lot about those terms towards the end, but firstly to look at the cultural forms that are evident, the new cultural forms that are evident on the internet. Of course, there are many, many, many cultural forms. So my survey does not intend to be comprehensive. My main criterion for choice has been those that have particular implications for digital literacies. Firstly, the email. As you can see, this is my own personal browser. Now, long before the web became widely available in the mid-1990s, people in the academy and business were using this electronic form of communication. When I took a course at Harvard in the mid-1980s entitled Writing and Computers, which was taught by Professor Colette Dayut, who's now at City University in America, in New York, her primary mode of communication, and this is in 1986, was by email. She communicated with her students by email. And I think that it was very odd because it was a very strange relationship to have to develop with a professor. And she really made it quite clear that she wanted us to communicate by email. At first I thought there was something wrong with her, but then afterwards I understood that she was doing this to try and make us become familiar with the new technologies ourselves. Now, all of us here, I think everybody in this room, knows how central email has become to our professional and social lives. Much attention has been given by researchers to the email message as a cultural form, arguing that it's a medium of communication that's developed its own rhetoric and language, but at the same time retaining its deep connections with its ancestors. All former and current modes and styles of human communication, written and spoken, are evident in email. The text message. Now, the ways in which people exploit ICTs in creative and unexpected ways is exemplified by the Scandinavian university students who worked out how to send text messages with phones, with mobile phones, a device that had been designed to communicate via voice. So it's a perfect example of the inventive ways in which people use language within the character constraints of a text message. And, of course, it's ignited a moral panic about the demise of formal language. And that was already raised this morning in one of the questions that someone asked Octavio. Texting has been directly connected to alienated youth, declining standards, poor academic achievement, and social breakdown. Now, I think that these connections can be questioned, and we certainly don't have to accept it, but these are the kinds of moral panics that we see in our newspapers and on television about the use of ICTs. The website. And this is the one I thought just related perfectly to the question about changes to language and shortening language. This is the website of my university in Melbourne, Australia, Monash University, and this is a website that is constantly changing. Every minute it's got something new, so it's moving continuously. And Monash has actually said, Monash asks, "Are you okay?" which was the question that somebody asked earlier this morning. Now, just think how the website has transformed since its initial incarnation in the mid-1990s. In those days, websites were predominantly text-based, formulaic, and static. Now, by contrast, today, they are far more interactive and creative, with a much greater reliance on visual forms of representation, including still images, animation, video, all dominating. Not only does this page, the home page of Monash University, change and respond to users' input, but the content featured each day is changed. The web team have to juggle, and this is the struggle of a home page of a university, between paying attention to the internal needs of the university, but also to the needs of external users who visit. Both purpose and audience, and these are words I'm sure are familiar to all of you who are teachers in primary and secondary school. Purpose and audience remain central, as they always have in the production of cultural forms. As with the email, it's useful to think of the website as a cultural form. It's characterised by specific textual strategies which users employ to generate meaning, and that's what this is all about. Digital literacies and our exploration of digital literacies and our efforts to understand what they are is all about the making of meaning. A grammar of the website is developed, but of course, much energy is exerted by developers to subvert that grammar in creative and unexpected ways. And that's something I keep on returning to, that at this stage of its early development, these digital technologies are seeming to invite creative responses. The next cultural form is the search engine, and I could spend the whole time today talking about Google, in one of the richest companies in the world, and how it's shaping our lives and the ways in which we think about things and about information and about knowledge. But a search engine designed to search for information on the World Wide Web began with Archie in 1990, but Google, which was founded in 1997, has since conquered the world. Search engines, as you know, operate algorithmically as a mixture of algorithm and human input. And of course, that balance is something that we all have to think about and talk about all the time, that relationship between the algorithm designed by the people working in new media and the human input. I use Google in the production of this paper to find the websites for the PowerPoint slides, but also to find other bits of information. understanding how search engines such as Google work is essential if critical literacy is the goal. I've just read a book by a young American activist called Pariza, I think he pronounced it, Eli Pariza, and he is extremely critical or skeptical about the way Google works. And he says that we make the assumption when we use a search engine such as Google that if I put in a search term and Julie puts in the same search term at her computer, that we would come up with a similar first page. And the answer to that is that we don't. So that there is not this neutral kind of response of the search engine to everybody in the same way, in the same consistent way. People get different responses, and we can talk about that later, but that's something that's very important, and of course to understand that is very important for our students in our classes in terms of critical literacy. One of my research students from China explained how she and her friends use proxies to get over the great firewall of China to use the search engines of their choice. And there are many writers in the field of new media who argue that the search engine, the age of the search engine, the time of the search engine is nearing an end. They predict that curation, and that's that word that I'm going to be exploring in much more detail tomorrow, they predict that curation is the new paradigm and that it will supersede search, so that we will be curating rather than searching very soon. Now that's a question, and I'm certainly not saying that's the reality, but it's something to think about. But I'll talk more about that tomorrow. Now, this is the print newspaper online, and I'm sure you've got examples of this in Colombia. The one I've chosen is The Age. It's a newspaper in Australia, in my home city of Melbourne, that's over 100 years old, and this newspaper still retains its print version, although that has got skinnier and skinnier as the years progress, and it has an online version. Print newspapers, as we know, are desperately trying to find a business model that will help them to recover from their loss of advertising revenue. Now, The Guardian, the English newspaper, The Guardian, is one of the few major global news enterprises that does not require a subscription for the online version. For The Guardian, the large audience and advertising have so far worked. They've got an enormous international global audience, and they get enough advertising to allow people just to have free access. But other leading print newspapers, such as the New York Times and The Australian, which is the national newspaper in Australia, have paywalls. Access is only allowed if you subscribe. Now, The Age, the Melbourne Daily in the slide, has a reduced print version and a limited amount of news available free online, and I just wonder if this is the same in Colombia, and subscriptions are required to access the full online version. Print version buyers are eligible for one version free, which is really very annoying. So my husband wanted to read the online version, so we get the print version and the online version, but he's the only one who gets access on his iPad to the online version. So it's a sign of inequality in the Snyder household. As a cultural form, the web version of newspapers is a true hybrid, but with huge losses in advertising and a new generation increasingly seeking news and information online, newspapers in print format are in crisis around the world, and it's not yet clear whether they will survive. Now, this is a new phenomenon. This is the truly online newspaper. The Huffington Post never had a print version. This newspaper was the mastermind of a very clever woman, Ariana Huffington, and it's been extraordinarily successful. We were noticing a decade ago how print newspapers were looking more and more like web pages, hyperlinks simulated on the left-hand side of the paper to take the reader to a page inside. There are many more images, and the images don't simply illustrate the written word, but are integral to the telling of the story and to the making of meaning. So this is where the notion of remediation is important. I should have chosen a newspaper that had Putin baring his chest, but this one's just him showing his face. Okay, remediation is quite a few years old now. This book was published in 1999, but I think that it captures a way of thinking about new media, which has already been mentioned this morning by Octavio, but something that many, many writers revisit in different ways. But Bolter and Grusin's theory of remediation, I think, offers a very compelling explanation of the ways in which the old and the new media interact. New media achieve their cultural significance by paying homage to, rivaling and refashioning earlier media, such as perspective painting, photography, film and television. Now, Bolter and Grusin called this process of refashioning remediation. And note that earlier media have always refashioned one another. Photography remediated painting, film remediated stage production and photography, and television remediated film, vaudeville, radio. Now, new digital media are doing exactly what their predecessors have done. They're presenting themselves as refashioned and improved versions of other media. Although our culture wants to multiply the media it has available, it also wants to erase all traces of mediation so that everything seems seamless. Accessing news, education and entertainment in the same medium, even from different sources, blurs the distinctions between the contexts in which each originated. Manuel Castells, who's someone, if you're not familiar with, he writes in Spanish, so he's one of the great sociologists, contemporary sociologists. He makes a similar point when he explains how different media borrow codes from each other so that interactive educational programs look like video games, newscasts are constructed as audio-visual shows, trial cases are broadcast as soap operas or novellas, which I've already asked about how popular the novellas are here in Colombia, and it seems that they are as popular as they are in other parts of South America. And pop music is composed for MTV. The cultural forms associated with the use of ICT do not simply represent a break with the past. The old and the new interact in complex ways, producing hybrid rather than wholly new forms. Now, the online broadcaster and television network. Again, you're seeing this interaction between the more traditional with the online. Now, the model that the ABC, that's the Australian Broadcasting Commission, uses, that's Australia's public broadcaster, has adopted isn't unusual. The ABC produces national and local television, radio, and an increasing array of online services. And I've asked someone here about Colombia, and apparently exactly the same thing is happening here with your Colombian television stations, that more and more is being available online in your own time, not always in real time. So in Australia, we've invested enormously in online development and content, with many programs available in digital formats as either live feeds or downloads. Now, just as remediation helps to explain the complex relationship between old and new, Henry Jenkins has devised this notion of convergence culture. And convergence, I think, is another useful notion to explain how the different modes of media production, once more or less discrete, are now coming together, often to create something new or newish. By convergence, Jenkins means the flow of content across multiple media platforms, the cooperation between multiple media industries, and the migratory behaviour of media audiences who go anywhere in search of the entertainment experiences they want. The blog, and this blog that I've chosen as an illustration is a woman who a woman called Eden Riley, and her blog was named the best blog in Australia in 2012, identified by the Sydney Writers' Centre. So people who are experts and famous for their print work identified her blog as a fantastic online display of writing. Blogs range from diary-like personal musings through reviews of movies and books to politically charged blow-by-blow accounts of real-time events such as wars, with some online blogs morphing into print books. I remember there were some very famous examples of that from the Arab Spring, and thereby enjoying exposure in a range of media. But that's, my interest is very often dominated by politics. And in Australia, we have a very famous journalist named Andrew Bolt, who writes for one of the Murdoch newspapers in Australia, and he has a very, very influential blog. And he's an ultra conservative journalist. Now, his blog is very influential, but this is what he does with his blog. Recently, he was charged with racial vilification charges. He said that there was a case in Australia where Aboriginal people in Australia, the Indigenous people, the first people in Australia, range in appearance from a skin colour that ranges from as pale as mine right through to very dark. And he said some terrible things, saying that people who had light-coloured skin had no right to identify as Aborigines. And he was charged. He was taken to court by some very senior Aborigines in Australia, Aboriginal leaders, and charged with racial vilification. So what Andrew Bolt did in his blog, he defended what he did, constantly defended his attacks on people of Aboriginal descent. But as the truth caught up with him and the court made a decision, he changed the record of his blog. So his blog no longer remained a true history of what he had written. So this is something I think is very interesting about electronic text, about the digital. So he changed the truth, really. Another thing that he's done is that he ridicules the names of Australian research grants. So when academics at universities apply for grants, and if they've got perhaps something that sounds a little bit postmodern or contemporary in their title, he makes fun of them in his blogs, and with a return in Australia to a very, very conservative government, he has power that some grants have been defunded. They have lost their money because Andrew Bolt ridiculed the projects as something not worthy of receiving money from the government. So there you have a Bolt, I keep saying Bolt. You have a blog that has power politically. Again, I'm hoping you're thinking all of the time of critical digital literacy. These are the kinds of things that we need to be talking about and thinking about with our students in our classrooms. Now, this one, Tumblr, is what's called a post-blog website. Now, Tumblr is one of many micro-blogging platforms and social networking site. It's owned by Yahoo. Micro is the key word here, as is convergence. Micro refers to the writing of short messages for reporting about what one is doing, thinking, or feeling at any one time. Now, the service also allows multimedia and other content to be posted in this format. And this particular microblog has rapidly gained the reputation for parading pornography. Not pornography, commercial pornography, in which lots of money is invested in creating it, but young people, not necessarily young people, but people making images of themselves in sexual encounters and posting them on the blogs. And this is what Tumblr, I just found out, has really become famous for. The wiki. A wiki is usually a web application that allows people to add, modify, or delete content in collaboration with others. Text is usually written using a simplified markup language or a rich text editor. Now, while a wiki is a type of content management system, it differs from a blog or most other such systems in that the content is created, and this is something I'm sure some of you are using with students in your classrooms, and they have a very implicit structure. Now, the encyclopedia, Wikipedia, which is the example I've used here in the slide, is by far the most famous wiki on the public web. But there are many other sites using different kinds of software. And they can serve as anything, as any of the examples, any of the cultural forms that I've illustrated here today. They can serve many, many different purposes. both public and private. Now, this is Flickr. I don't know whether any of you use Flickr or other photo sharing websites. It's a popular photo sharing site which allows people to upload, display and share photos. Now, it was first launched in 2004. It has over 50 million active users and over 6 billion photos have been posted. Now, although photos are perceived as a central element of Flickr, users interact through writing. They give titles, captions, and tags. And tags are a very important thing, I think, for us to think about in the context of digital literacy, because it's a way of maybe, if I'm coming back to that word curation, it's a way of curating and editing what people see and how they see things. Now, the music sharing website. I've included Spotify, even though there are many, many music websites, and with a very important history that I'm sure you're all familiar with about whether about raising all sorts of issues about copyright. And even though music sharing is not related directly to the digital literacy focus of the presentation, it does, I think, serve to highlight the very complex intellectual property issues involved in much internet activity. Now, Napster might have lost the court case, but millions of people around the world continue to download music and, of course, videos without observing copyright laws. And there are some very, very eminent scholars at universities such as Harvard who argue very strongly that these copyrights should be waived in the context of the internet. So it's a very provocative, very controversial area. Again, something I think that us as users, but also as teachers, should be thinking about and talking about in the context of critical digital literacy education in our classrooms. And of course, YouTube. I just love videos of cats. Do people like videos of cats on YouTube? The video sharing website. Now, YouTube was established in 2005. It has more than 800 million users who visit the site each month and more than 70 hours of video uploaded every minute. It's often seen as a social networking site rather than just a site for uploading videos, which is due to the special relationships developed between video users, uploaders, and their viewers. Now, these relationships are often developed through multimodal means, and commenting, and this is what's so typical of many, many of these sites, and if we're concerned about digital literacy, the capacity to include text on these sites, I think, is very important for us if we're thinking about critical digital literacy. And of course, the social networking site. I think this slide was a badly chosen one. Apparently in Colombia, you use Facebook. I put in Orkut, which is owned by Google, and the reason I chose Orkut is I go to Brazil pretty often, and in Brazil, Orkut is the most popular social networking site. So I just kind of made a ridiculous assumption that other parts of Latin America might also be using it. So there's no need for me to say much about Web 2. As Colombians, I know, are using social networking a lot. Web 2 has had an enormous social impact worldwide, reshaping the ways in which we communicate. Now, the claims that are made about the power and influence of social networking are not dissimilar to claims about earlier technologies, but more about what is called technological determinism a little later. Facebook. As we all know, the number of users of Facebook launched in 2004 reached over 900 million users, but interestingly, that number has either plateaued or begun to drop, but something's funny going on with Facebook. It's structured around user profiles, now called timelines, and status updates, now simply posts, and it's a space designed for microblogging. Whenever I give a talk anywhere in the world, what happened? Yeah. Whenever I give a talk anywhere in the world, I always have to mention William Gibson, and lots of people who work in this area mention William Gibson. And if you've never read anything by him, please do. He's most famous for having invented the word cyberspace in the mid-80s, but his contemporary novels are wonderful, and they're wonderful satires and critiques of contemporary America. William Gibson is also famous, even though he writes about, in a kind of a science fiction way, about these new media and foresaw the internet. He hasn't actively engaged with the media himself. However, he is with Twitter. Twitter is something that William Gibson finds a very interesting medium. And you know, the tweet is limited in the number of words that you can use. But what he says is that the retweet, the capacity to forward on someone else's message to other people of your choice, is the power and the interest that he has in Twitter. Now, the curation, there's his most recent book, but that's a book of essays, which if you're interested in what he says about new media, that's a really good one to read. That came out last year. The curation website, there are many of these, but the one I've chosen to show you today is it's called Stumble Upon. Now, this is, I joined Stumble Upon, and I had to fill in some details about myself, and I said that I was interested in architecture and design and photography, and Stumble Upon then sends me a message each day which gives me websites that they think I would be interested in because of my particular personal interests. And so this is what happens. You get a message from Stumble Upon, and that takes you to collections of photos. It's always been so far very way off. Occasionally there's something that I really like, but this is an example of a very crude and a crude curation website, but again, more of that tomorrow, because I do think that this whole notion of curation is something that we need to be thinking about and talking about. Now, I've expressed the flash mob. This is an image of ice cream politics in Belarus. Now, in 2006, people gathered to express their hostility to the government. It's a dictatorship in Belarus. They gathered in the city square, the town square, to express their hostility to the government in a silent protest. They communicated with each other by SMS to meet at the town square at a particular time, and they all arrived there eating ice creams. And this was seen by the government as an attack on the government. All they did was eat ice creams. So that is ice cream politics in Belarus. This is clapping politics in Belarus. Another example of how brave people found an innovative way to use new media to protest against an oppressive regime. The words on the T-shirt say, "Go away, Lukashenko." Now, the government tried to thwart the protest by blocking access to Facebook, Twitter, and a major Russian social networking site called Sergey. And the government also, this is what's interesting, they also banned clapping. So before they banned Facebook and Twitter, they also banned clapping. But it had a rather ironic effect. My doctoral student, and of course I know everything about these things purely through my doctoral students, they're a wonderful source of knowledge. My doctoral student from Belarus told me that when President Lukashenko recently spoke at a public meeting, no one clapped. And so they gathered all of the people that normally come to these public demonstrations, and the cameras are on them, and they're all supporting the dictator, but no one dared clap because they were scared of the repercussions. So this was a paradox of his ban on clapping. But not all flash mobs are politically motivated. Frozen Grand Central was, this actually was what initiated the flash mob phenomenon. It was uploaded in 2008 with more than 33.5 million views. Now, you can have a look at this on YouTube. It shows a whole lot of people communicated by SMS to meet at Grand Central Station at a particular time, and they just all froze. Somebody clicked and they all froze in their movement, and they stayed still in the middle of the station for a few minutes, and then they unfroze and walked away. So it can be for fun as well. The massively multiplayer online role-playing game, again, something that you are all familiar with, and I know that your students are also very familiar with. L.A. Noire is an Australian example of the genre, and what makes it such a... I don't actually play games myself, but what makes this, I think, so interesting is the production values that are used in these games. And L.A. Noire is absolutely beautiful environment. I've been intrigued by what James G, has said about why we, as teachers, need to think about these video games. And his argument is that the designers of these video games employ the best principles of science educators, the traditional ways in which science educators have taught their subject and taught it well. And he said that there's something so engaging about the ways in which these games work, and that teachers should be thinking about what is it that makes these games work, because maybe we could find ways to engage our students better in our classrooms. He's not suggesting that we use video games necessarily in our classrooms, but just to investigate why they work so well with young people. The virtual world, Second Life. It's a 3D virtual world where users design avatars to represent themselves. Monash owns several islands in Second Life that has its own economy, the Linden economy. I led a small research project a few years ago with some of my research students, and we were doing some teaching within Second Life, and that was quite fun. I know that must remember the reason I'm showing you all of these different cultural forms is to provoke you to think about what are the implications of these cultural forms that people are using in their millions for critical digital literacy education. Now, the fan website, and I've chosen Harry Potter. I'm sure Harry Potter's been translated into Spanish, and you have children here who perhaps weren't good readers who have read Harry Potter. The fan website, you go to a website like Harry Potter website and you can find out all sorts of things about the actors, about the stories, about the author, all sorts of things. But perhaps more interesting is the fan fiction website, again, the Harry Potter one, where people write, people join, they use the basic ideas of and characters from Harry Potter, but then are creative in their own right, and they write their own fictions that sometimes only have very loose connections to the original. But this is, again, another digital form that encourages and provokes young people to engage actively in writing. The e-book. And this is perhaps where I'd need to talk to Octavio, because it was as if e-books didn't exist. And you were talking mainly about the print form. But I know that in Australia, publishers are doing, the selling of books is better than it's ever been. So people are still reading books, but maybe on a Kindle or on their iPad, not necessarily in the print format. So the collapse of Borders and other large bookstores is emblematic of the crisis in the book industry, as it scrambles as newspapers to find a new business model. But there are now many, many websites selling ebooks. And there's a fantastic ebook available called The Literacy Wars, and if you haven't read that, it's an absolute must. And it's, of course, much, much cheaper than the print version. Now, again, I've come back to Harry Potter, not because I've only read one of the books myself, but I find Rowling, the author of Harry Potter, a really very, very interesting woman, not just for her writing capacity and her success and how she's engaged young children with the stories, but also her business model. Now, this is very similar to what the Beatles tried in the 60s, which is, most of you are far too young for that, to remember that, but with their Apple label in the 60s, they tried to control the sale of all of their music and all of the merchandise associated with it, but for a whole lot of reasons that didn't work. She has done something similar today, so that she sells everything from her own website. So you can buy books, of course you can buy them in stores as well, but you can buy books and merchandise and all sorts of things through her website. So maybe that is a model for the future, who knows? Now, what are the dominant genres of the internet? I asked the lovely young man who's doing the interpreting today, when I showed him these slides last night, before I showed him this slide, what he thought was the dominant genres of the internet, and he said immediately sport. Well, the two dominant genres of the internet are pornography and gambling. And they are by far that's what most people do when they go on the internet. And it's not probably that different to what we do in the real world. According to BBC News, and this is recent, about 30% of all net traffic is generated by porn sites, while the AFP, a global news agency, reported that in 2012, Americans spent $2.6 billion on online gambling, with $33 billion spent worldwide. Now, this is something that I'm very concerned about, have done some research on, and I think, again, if we're concerned about critical digital literacy in the context of our classrooms and the work we do with our students, then we have to think about ubiquitous marketing that is absolutely everywhere. Club Penguin is I think that's in Spanish. Is that in Spanish? Yeah. No, what is it? But even Club Penguin, which is a site for children, which is supposed to be a safe site where children can go, it's absolutely dominated by marketing. And that's obvious marketing, let alone the much more implicit marketing and other ways that marketers have devised to sell things to people. So there's something that we have to think about. Marketing extends into an expanding media culture, which includes mobile phones, instant messaging, video games, virtual worlds, social networking, YouTube, Flickr, Tumblr, StumbleUpon, all of these places, all of the sites that I've shown you so far. We could do an analysis of each one of those sites to look at the extraordinarily sophisticated use of marketing techniques to encourage you to buy things and to think in certain ways. So, there are many, many cultural forms evident on the internet. These cultural forms, and there are many others, embody new understandings of what it means to be literate today. Now, these cultural forms are part of the repertoire integral to contemporary literate practice. In the 1990s, we now call the social and semiotic turns in literacy research, they came together. So there was a social turn where people started emphasising the importance of interactions and relationships, and then the semiotic, where we're looking at the multimodality and the importance of the visual. They've now come together, the social and the semiotics. And the result has been that researchers are now examining a wide range of places and texts. The social turn's largely ethnographic research has broadened understandings of where literacy happens, and has shown literacy to be a social practice, not solely a cognitive one. The semiotic turn has opened up textual formats to include the multiple modes we naturally invoke as we communicate in our everyday lives, as exemplified when people use gestures and draw pictures when they create stories. And the semiotic also recognises, as that short film about writing, the history of writing that we began the day with, that there's an expanded range of modes, the audio, the visual, the multimedia, that they are all prevalent today in digitally mediated textual production. The semiotic turn highlights that although the written text remains central, even privileged, text only is increasingly rare. Rarely do we see something, and we'd probably be pretty disappointed if we saw something that was just text, just words. Being literate across multiple modes is expected for successful contemporary education. Being literate involves the ability to deal with the flow of stories. It's also important that the many, many cultural forms can be used for multiple purposes. And I think I've raised some of those issues today, for good and for bad. A website can be used to promote democracy. It can also be used to incite hatred. Just think of the Andrew Bolt blog, but also of the ice cream politics in Belarus. But my point is not that ICTs are neutral, nor is it that it's people who do things with ICTs and that's what's important. It's both. We can't think of the technologies themselves as neutral, but it's also problematic to ascribe too much power to the people who use them. So let me explain what I mean here. Technological determinism is a horrible term, but I hope that these examples give you explain what I mean by it. We make claims about the power and the impact of technology in the ways in which we talk, the ways in which we are very common ways of speaking. We say the web has democratised the availability of information. But then when you think about what I explained happens in a dictatorship such as Belarus, is that true? Social networking has changed the way we interact. Maybe, maybe not. Text messaging was responsible for the Arab Spring, and that's been said a lot. There's been books written about the importance of social media and the Arab Spring. Definitely important, but how important? How important is the technology? Now, social determinism is the inverse. When Time magazine, in this cover in 2006, said, you are the person of the year, they said, you control the internet. Welcome to your world. So that's when the Time magazine was ascribing all the power to us. We're in control. We can shape everything. I don't think that that's the case either. So it's neither the technology nor the people. This ignores the fact, and the reality is that the hardware and the software, and we have to think about this if we're involved in critical digital literacy, that their design are shaping and influencing the ways in which we interact. Take a look at the work of Lev Manovich. He's one of my heroes, writing about new technologies, and he is writing now, turning to the importance of software. And his latest book, I think it's really just a version of that one that was available online, his latest book that was just published this year is called Software Takes Command. And I don't expect you to read the whole book, it's really quite difficult, and he's a software, he can actually program himself, so I think he assumes a lot of stuff. But the politics of this book is very, very important. He's saying that we have to think about the design, and what software allows you to do and what it doesn't allow you to do. And that is really, really important in terms of how it shapes the ways in which we interact. The most important way, the most useful way, I think, to think about technology is to recognise that technologies have effects on people and that people also shape their forms and their uses. So we have to look at those interactions. So let's come back to those key terms: literacy, cultural form, ICT, and critical literacy. Now, I don't think I need to say very much. A lot of it's been implicit, and it's already been said in Octavio's presentation, I think, about what literacy is. It's about reading and writing. Traditionally, it's about reading and writing print text, but now it includes multimodal texts. Cultural form, I like that term because it's when we think about everything that's happening on the internet as part of our culture and as influencing our culture and shaping our culture, and whether it's a participatory culture, which is what Jenkins is now writing about. I used his notion of convergence before. That cultural forms, it's just a useful tag for us to talk about all of these different things around us. They're distinctive kinds of texts, and it's up to us to think about these texts, what their features are, and how they influence us. ICTs are more than just tools and applications. They also have social and cultural dimensions, and we have to think about that. And critical literacy. I think I've hinted at what I mean in the context of new technologies. I hope that if I just stopped now and just turned it over to you, and I could say to you, well, what do you think Ilana means about critical digital literacy? You'd have an idea. It's integral to our job, to our job as educators, to tackle patterns of inequality. It means more than learning simply how to, not simply, but it's more than encoding and decoding print and digital texts, although Knowing how to read and write is absolutely vital and is part of our core business. It also means learning how contemporary texts are used to analyse and transform relations of culture, social and political power. The aim is to enhance students' capacity to reflect critically on the inequalities around them and to produce texts to analyse, critique, represent the relationships that they see around them. Now, to return to the question with which I began. What counts as critical literacy in contemporary education, influenced by the use of ICT? A critical literacy approach shows how the seamless ways of representing human experience are not disinterested. They're not objective. The aim of critical literacy in teaching is the promotion of an attitude of informed scepticism. A critical approach to the internet argues that the meanings of words, images and sounds can't be separated from their contexts in which they're constructed. It recognises the non-neutrality of all texts, including the digital. A critical approach to the internet highlights the complex relationships between language, power, social groups and social practices. We can't ignore the effect that technology has on every aspect of our lives. We need new capabilities to make sense of what we learn, how to evaluate and critically appraise both the information we are given or locate and its source. As consumers of information, we need to be able to find out how to do this without direct instruction. We also need to enjoy the opportunity, we all now enjoy the opportunity of producing information and knowledge. And these new media have demonstrated their power at a political level. But in education, we have to learn how to harness technology to develop the collective capabilities of groups. As industry moves more to team-based workplaces, these capabilities become even more important. And school and curriculum can't afford to let them pass them by. If we don't prepare students properly to live and work in a new technologically driven world, then their lack of education will hurt them and the rest. Now, I just got to end with another one of my heroes, and this is where, and now I'm going to turn it over to you, but just to Philip Roth, who should have got the Nobel Prize so far, but he hasn't, and I love Alice Munro, so I'm not upset that she won it, but Philip Roth has to get it before he dies because you can't get a Nobel Prize after you're dead. So he hasn't, he's getting pretty old. This is a book that he wrote quite a long time ago, and it's called I Married a Communist. And at the beginning of this book, there's a character, a school teacher, from a school teacher that he had, or the main character in the book had, in the late 1940s, post-Second World War, New Jersey, or Newark, where he wrote. And the name of the teacher is Murray Ringgold. He was his English teacher. Now, I've written this in English, so I hate to think how it's going to be, it's hard to translate, but let me just read these words, and this is where I'm going to end. A crusty, brash, bald-headed guy, rangy and athletic, who hovered over our heads in a perpetual state of awareness. His passion was to explain, to clarify, to make us understand, with the result that every last subject we talk about, he broke down into its principal elements no less meticulously than he diagrammed sentences on the blackboard. Ringgold taught his student that thinking is the greatest transgression of all. Critical thinking. Critical thinking, Mr. Ringgold said, using his knuckles to rap out each of the syllables on his desktop. There is the ultimate subversion. Now, although he worked in a post-Second World War classroom in which the most complex literacy technology was a blackboard, his approach to teaching and learning, his keen understanding of the key to knowledge, embodies my view of what critical literacy today, in the age of the internet, means. It's improving the world, making it a better place, subverting what is undesirable, just like those ice cream protesters in Belarus. It can only be facilitated if students are given opportunities to develop their critical thinking. So whether it's critical thinking or critical literacy, it's the most significant goal of literacy education in the age of the internet.
Nosotros promovemos todas estas redes sociales en los jóvenes porque es lo que los atrae. Mi preocupación es que se vuelve una lectura y una escritura muy superficial, porque pues es lo que ellos quieren. ¿Cómo los llevamos a que para ser críticos yo tengo que profundizar en algo? Y esto promueve, o sea, es contradictorio a lo que se pretende.
Okay, very good question. Okay, very good question. Now I'm going to take these out. I can't have his voice in my ear as I try and answer. That's a really good question. I think that it comes back to the very first question today about are we going to have great losses in literacy if we have different kinds of textual formations where we reduce text in social networking sites where we have abbreviations and people write not in full sentences and they have their own language on the internet. I don't have any problem with that whatsoever. I think that is something that you need to think about and talk about with the students. That's your role as an educator, and that there are different kinds of texts for different purposes and for different audiences. And I think that that's one of the old things when you learn to be a teacher, that purpose and audience is something that are things that we must think about. And the kind of text that is produced in social media sites, I think, is absolutely perfect for the purpose and for the audience. But that is one kind of purpose and one kind of audience, and there are texts that we need to produce for different purposes and for different audiences. And that's our responsibility as teachers. We have to, I think that if students had that awareness, that those kinds of texts are inventive, subversive, all of those wonderful creative things that we see in these social networking sites, yes, but that belongs there. And in other kinds of settings, you need to produce different kinds of texts. And it's our job to help them to produce those different kinds of texts for different purposes and different audiences.
¿Dónde más hay preguntas? Por allí.
A pesar de que existe el licenciamiento con la licencia Creative Commons, ¿por qué todavía existe mayor material sin licenciamiento y que todo el mundo llama como plagio a utilizar más contenido con esa licencia? O sea, ¿por qué existe esa desigualdad de existir más contenido sin licenciamiento y que lo utilizan y lo copian y lo trasladan, que utilizar el que es licenciado Creative Commons precisamente para esos fines?
Okay. Okay, that's a fantastic question. And I've just been doing a lot of reading about that myself. And as I said, I think I mentioned in the talk very, very briefly that there are key writers in the States. What's his name? Lawrence, I can't think of Lessig, Lawrence Lessig from, I think he's still at Harvard. There are a couple, the names have escaped me for the moment, but there are some very leading people arguing and writing in this area. There's a professor at Stanford, John Walensky, who used to be at UBC, writing in this area. So there are lots of arguments out there. Some people argue, there's a whole range of arguments, from saying that we need to protect copyright so that if somebody produces something, they should get the value and reward for what they produced, right through to very radical professors such as Lawrence Lessig, who say that this is crazy, you can't control it, the plug's already been pulled out, there's no way you're ever going to be able to control copyright for videos and for all of and books and all of the things. It's mainly video now. It was music, but now it's the big thing is Hollywood trying to retain its control of video and to get the money for the videos of films. I'm not quite sure. I've been doing a lot of reading in this area and I'm not quite sure where I sit. I think that, although I do belong to organisations about the commons, so it's very, very complex issues, and I'm so glad that you've raised it, because I'm doing some work for a new book at the moment, and it's something that I'm going to have to take up. But as I said, I don't have a position. But this, I think, is something that should be discussed in our classrooms. This is something that should be discussed with students. If they're doing something illegal, downloading a video illegally, because that's what the current law is, talk about it. Should these laws be changed? Should they be advocating for the change of these laws? Or should they just be breaking the law? I can tell you it's very tempting for me. I love Danish thrillers. Do you get the Danish thrillers here? The Killing, and lots of, there's Borgen, the one about the female Danish Prime Minister. But people download these. All of my friends get the latest series of these, and I'm in such a dilemma. I so much want to watch the latest series, but do I watch something that's been downloaded illegally, or do I wait until the video becomes available commercially? These are personal dilemmas, and I think that we all face them, and it's something that we should be talking about in our classrooms with our students.
Gracias, Ilana. Cuando en España explicas a los docentes que es importante que enseñen a leer críticamente, a buscar la ideología, a relacionar los textos que leen con las desigualdades, a luchar contra la pobreza, a respetar los derechos de todos, ves que se ponen incómodos en muchos casos, y uno de los argumentos principales que dicen es que ellos no hacen política, que la escuela no tiene que enseñar ideologías. ¿Qué les podemos decir a estos docentes? Gracias.
It's another fantastic question. And the dilemmas that we face as educators. It's, I think I've made the point pretty clearly that it is impossible to be neutral. The technologies aren't neutral, the hardware, the software aren't neutral, the people who use them aren't using them objectively. The ways in which we have encounters and social relationships in our everyday lives are not neutral. It's impossible to keep politics out of the classroom, because it's impossible to be, you can not be overt in your politics, but even if you don't think you're being political, you're being political. And I think, again, that's something we have to talk about with our students. How do you deal with the departments of education, the parents, I think the governments that say that politics don't belong in the classroom? I think you have to argue, and that's a position that I find very, very difficult to accept, and I would argue about it. But going into a classroom and using the classroom as a platform for your ideological beliefs and imposing them on students, that's also bad. So, I mean, it's finding that balance within the classroom, but it's about being explicit, about being clear, it's about establishing that relationship with the students about what your position is. Hard one.
¿Más preguntas por allí? Bien, vamos adelante.
Buenos días. Otra vez, la pregunta es relacionada. El acceso a la información que nosotros tenemos en la actualidad es mucho, pero yo quisiera saber qué opinión tiene con respecto a las diferencias, la diferencia que existe entre la clase social alta y la baja con respecto al acceso a la información, porque si bien la información es pública en mucha medida, el acceso a ella se tiene que hacer por diversos dispositivos que muchas veces la clase social baja no puede acceder a ellos. Entonces mi pregunta es si cree que incrementa la diferencia entre la clase social alta y la baja acceso a la información particular con las nuevas tecnologías.
Again, another excellent question. The whole issue of access is, again, another very complex one. I suppose I can get out of every question and say it's complex. Just making the internet available to people is certainly not enough, and a lot has been written by some terrific researchers and academics about access and the notion of access, that we have to understand that it's more than just having an internet connection. It's all about what Bourdieu would call cultural capital as well. It's about what you do with that access to the information, what you do with that information, and how you use that information. So just giving access is not going to create social equality. And again, this is, I think, a big responsibility of students, of teachers in classrooms, so that you have a whole range of young people in the classroom from various backgrounds, some more advantaged than others, and you have to be aware of what the students bring with them to the classroom from their own environment, and to value what they bring, but also to give them access to other forms of capital within the classroom. Hard stuff, and that's why being a teacher is so important and so very, very challenging.
Bien, nos quedan aproximadamente 5 minutos para preguntas. Adelante.
Que estas formas culturales nacen de la misma sociedad, no desde una propuesta de la escuela. La escuela se enfrenta a ellas hoy en día. En el caso de esa relación formas culturales y escuela, ¿qué es lo que debe hacer, digamos, el gobierno, la misma escuela, para implementarlas o acogerlas en su quehacer? Le digo esto porque muchos docentes saben de esas formas culturales, las usan, las tienen, pero es paradójico, no las implementan en su día a día educativo. Y puede ser por varias razones, por una percepción negativa. Yo he conocido colegas docentes donde dicen, el internet, eso es un demonio, ni riesgos con eso. Entonces, regresamos a los métodos tradicionales, los métodos que nos han dado más efectividad desde la escuela. Entonces, esa es mi pregunta, ¿cómo esas formas culturales las debe de coger la escuela, el sistema educativo y aplicarlos? Gracias.
Okay, again, a really interesting question. And this raises lots of issues that are discussed continuously in education. Yes, we need to be aware of what young people are doing outside school, but then do we bring what they do outside school that engages them into school and use those cultural forms within school for education, because we know they're going to engage them? I think the immediate reaction is that if you started using Facebook in a classroom, it's more than likely that the students would find somewhere else to go rather than Facebook, because Facebook would become schooled, and that's not what they want. They want something independent. I'm trying to make a point, I think, a bit differently, and that's you said that yes, we use all of these media, we're familiar with these cultural forms in our lives, but do they have a place within the classroom? I think they do have a place within the classroom, in the sense of talking about them, so that you can develop a critical approach to them, so that they can think about, if nothing else, software. If nothing else, just about what choices have been created within that particular space or program, and what you can't do. That is just so important for young people to be thinking about that. It's not as if Facebook is a neutral territory where you can communicate with friends. It's full of advertising, it's full of the personalisation. I mean, there is a lot of stuff being written at the moment that it's making it so personalised, so that you get just what you're interested in, that you don't become a participant in democracy and civic culture, because all you're concerned about is yourself, because that's what these worlds create. Now, if that's the case, I think that as teachers we have the responsibility to talk about these kinds of issues, even if it's as an issue, to look at Facebook on a board, on a screen, not necessarily to use it, but to look at the way Facebook shapes us and shapes our relationships. So yes, it does have a place. I'm not so in favour of let's use these things because it's going to engage the kids, and so let's use them because it'll just be a jumping off point. Many people argue that. There are lots of arguments, different kinds of arguments for their place in the classroom. My particular perspective is let's be aware about how these things work and what impact they have, socially, culturally, politically, economically.
Hay espacio para una última pregunta.
No, ya.
Adelante.
Bueno, estamos en una época quizá de transición en la cual los jóvenes están expuestos a propuestas teóricas, a propuestas legales, a propuestas que marca la sociedad, pero simultáneamente a acciones que violan, que transgreden la propuesta. Podríamos señalar entonces que con el uso democrático o con el acceder a la información a través de las web, por ejemplo, o de las redes sociales, como una opción democrática, podríamos señalarles a los jóvenes que podemos interpelar las normas con el propósito único desde la ética de hacer siempre el bien.
That's a very radical proposal. I don't think that our job as teachers is to recruit people for taking action against things that they're unhappy about. That's kind of the next step. But I think it's about developing a critical awareness so that they can make their decisions themselves. That's not necessarily something that has to happen in the classroom, but I think that individual critical awareness and group political awareness is important. Not so much political, so critical awareness is what's important. But that's a wonderfully radical question for which to end, I think, this presentation.
Thank you, teacher.